Hi, my name is Lori Listerman, and through this PowerPoint presentation, I'm going to answer the 4 questions on special education assessment. So here we go. Question number 1. Define least restrictive environment and discuss this concept as it relates to models of delivery for special services. So let's start out with least restrictive environment. Let's talk about it. Least restrictive environment is a federal law that students with disabilities receive their education in a regular classroom for the maximum time with non-disabled peers, and that these special education students are not removed from the regular classes unless, even with supplemental aids or services, that their education in regular classrooms cannot be achieved satisfactorily. So let's talk about these steps from least restrictive environment to the most restrictive environment. For the least restrictive environment, we have that students are in regular education classrooms with special education consultation. And basically this means that, again, the students are in regular classrooms, but the teacher also gets support from the special education teacher where she can ask questions, get some ideas, things like that. If that is not working, we will move to the student receiving regular education with direct in-class special education support. So that means that the student is in the regular education classroom but receives support from the special education teacher. If the student still is struggling, we will move on to resource room, the special education support in a separate room. So that's stating that the students will get some individual instruction or can be in a group setting instruction in that room. So they are pulled out of the regular education classroom for a certain subject and placed in the resource room for extra help. If the student still needs more help, the student will then be placed in a self-contained special education program. And this is a program with specialized instruction for kids with similar learning needs. And they will be in that classroom all day. If the student still needs extra help, then resources will be needed to find a program outside of the school district. When you get to that point, you're in the most restrictive environment. We also need to remember that IEPs, which we will talk about in a little bit, describes the special education services that the student will receive, but that they also must address least restrictive environments and why student is being placed outside of the general education classroom. All right, let's move on. Question number 2. Why is the assessment process described as a cycle, and why are the components of the special education assessment process? What are the components? Sorry. Okay, so let's start with the assessment process. Why is it a cycle? Well, it's a cycle because one step leads to another step, which leads to another step, which then leads to another step. So it's a cycle completely around, starting from the beginning, cycling on around to the end. So you can start with identify and referral, cycling down to determination of eligibility, cycling to program planning, and cycling to the implementation of the program. But let's talk about some of these components. The first one, identify and referral. We are going to identify students by the teachers, by the parents, that the student needs some help and needs to be referred for special education services. Once that is done, then the next step, cycling it down, will be the determination of eligibility. Is the student eligible for special education services? This requires not only the parent's permission for the assessment, but once the parent gives the permission, then a administrator will be assigned to administer the test to the student. Excuse me. Once that is done, scoring will be done, and the administrator will report back the results of the scores. And the special education team will get together and determine whether or not the student qualifies for special education services. Now, if they do, the next step, cycling on around, is the program planning. This is where the IEP is written on what the student needs, what are some of the goals, if they will be in a regular education classroom along with a special education classroom. All that information is in the IEP, and the parent will needs to approve the IEP for that to continue. Also, last, program implementation and evaluation. This is where basically the IEP is implemented and the student works on the goals that are written in the IEP. We need to remember that IEPs are evaluated once a year with the special education team along with the parents, but they will progress and monitor the student throughout the year to see how they are working on that. Moving on, question number 3. Describe at least 5 strategies a professional can use to encourage family participation in the special education process. So let's start with number 1, communication. This is very important when it comes to working with our parents. We need to be able to communicate with them. We need to let them know what's going on. Some ways that we can communicate with them is phone calls, emails, text messages, even notes being sent home to let them know what's going on, to ask them questions, anything like that. We need to show commitment to our parents. By doing that, we can let these parents know that we are there for their students, we are there for them. We want to make sure that they know that you have an open door policy. They're welcome to come in anytime, talk to you, see their student. We need to make sure that we're acknowledging their presence because they are important. And not only is the student important, but the parents are important as well. Skills. We need to make sure as professionals that we are up to date and qualified for the job. We always need to be seeking continuing education to make sure that we are up to date on the new findings, the new resources that are available for our students. Trust. We need to have our parents trust us. We need to do what we're going to say that we're going to do. We need to follow through. You know, we need to speak honestly with our parents, which can be hard. Sometimes you need to address some things with parents that you don't want to address, but we need to be honest with them, let them know what's going on. We need to follow through with what we say that we're going to do. And last, respect. We need to respect our students. We need to, and parents. We need to be courteous with our parents. We need to be formal with our parents at first. Mr. and Mrs., how are you today? Until they give you permission to use their first names. And we need to make sure that we are formal in addressing other members of the team as well. This is Mr. So-and-so. My name is Mrs. Listerman. Things like that. Last, let's move on to number 4. Compare and contrast 3 types of derived scores. We're going to talk about percentile ranks, standard scores, and I'm going to butcher this, I know I am, Stanines scores, and that may not even be close, and if it's not, I'm sorry. Let's talk about percentile ranks. Percentile ranks are percentages of individuals within the norm group who achieved the raw score or even a lower one. And what I'm talking about is, let me give you an example. If a raw score of 40 corresponds to a percentile rank of 62, then that means that 62% of the norm group earned a raw score of 40 or less. Standard scores. These are derived scores that transform the raw scores to a new scale with a set, mean, and standard deviation. These are useful for comparing the performance of the same individual on two different measures as long as the raw score distributions of the measures are similar. And last, again, I'm going to butcher this, Stanines. The Stanine distribution is divided into 9 segments, each of which are 0.5 standard deviation in width. Again, I probably butchered that and I apologize. But because they represent a range of performance rather than a specific score, the data they provide are less precise than those from standard scores. So, if the purpose of assessment is to compare a student's performance to that of a norm group, the most informative type of score is the normalized standard score. However, same information can be obtained from a measure that is not normally distributed if it provides both standard scores and percentile ranks. And we need to remember that we need to avoid tests that offer only age and grade equivalence. But if those are used, then either percentile ranks or standard scores, or even both, should accompany them.